Mhm.
Okay. Well, hello, Lisa. Welcome. Thanks for being here. Maybe tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got interested in William Scarlett Hagans.
Sure. So I live in Atlanta now, but I was born and raised in Wilson. Of course, I don't know, maybe 12 miles, 15 miles, maybe from the CB Aycock home place.
Mhm.
Um, and for a long time, I've really been interested in both genealogy and Southern and African American history. And as it turns out, William Scarlett Hagans is a cousin of mine. His father, Napoleon Hagans, um, had a half sister, Frances Seabury,
Mhm.
um, who was my great great grandmother.
Oh, wow.
So, in researching my family history, I got to know William S. Hagans.
Cool, cool. Could you maybe tell us a little bit about his family, like who his parents were, and maybe a little bit about like his community in the Fremont and Hunter area at the time?
Sure. So his William Hagans' father, Napoleon, was named Napoleon Hagans. And his mother was named Apsilla Ward. And Napoleon Hagans was born about 1840. He was born to a free woman of color, so that he himself was also born free. We don't know who his father was. And he most likely was born somewhere in the very far east, northeast corner of Wayne County, somewhere up around the Turner Swamp area. Apsilla was born either in just below Stantonsburg in Wilson County, or maybe in Greene. She was born enslaved. Her father was her owner. His name was Dr. David G.W. Ward, and her mother was an enslaved Sarah Ward. So they, Napoleon Hagans and Sarah and Apsilla Ward married somewhere around 1867 or so. We have not found a marriage license, but they had two sons, Henry Edward Hagans, and in 1868, and then Napoleon and then William in 1869. And by the time that William and Edward were born, their father was already on his way to becoming a successful farmer in that area between Eureka and Fremont. That Napoleon had grown up in a fairly large community of free people of color. Wayne County had two centers of free people of color, one in that Eureka area and one south around Dudley. And so the families in the Eureka area would have been the Artises, the Reeds, the Haganses, the Halls, and Seaburys were the largest families. So that's the community in which his father grew up. And William would have grown up as among a very sort of small, privileged class of prosperous African American farmers in that area in the 1870s and 80s.
Okay, and I'm correct in that Wayne County had at least before the Civil War, and I imagine afterward, Wayne County had a very sizable population of free people of color. It was one of the largest in the state,
Yes.
Was it not?
It was one of the largest. If I recall from my master's thesis, I think it was the ninth largest. The largest were along the Virginia and South Carolina. So counties like Halifax, Northampton, Hertford had the largest on the north side, and on the south side, counties like Sampson, Cumberland had larger populations, but in sort of central eastern North Carolina, Wayne County was far and above, had the largest population. There were approximately 900 plus free people of color counted in the 1860 census, and that was probably an undercount.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And the Aycock family living just south of Fremont would have had direct connection with a lot of these free families, including the artists who were indentured apprentices by the Aycock family in the 1840s and 1850s.
Yes, the Artist family was the largest free family of color in Wayne County. It's a huge extended family. It originated in Southside Virginia and started migrating into North Carolina right after the Revolution, right after the Revolutionary War, such that by 1840, the Wayne County census shows 40-something heads of household named artists. So it's a tremendously large family, so large, in fact, that its descendants don't perceive themselves as being one family. It's kind of like Smith. You know, if your name is Smith, you don't assume that you're related to all the Smiths. Mm-hmm. The artists don't assume that they're related to each other, though ultimately they would have been. So I'm an artist. I'm descended from an artist, Adam T. Artist, who was a contemporary, slightly older than of Napoleon, and as I mentioned, married Napoleon's sister. And the Artist brothers, who were apprenticed to C.V. Aycock's father, were undoubtedly distant relatives of Adam Artist, but we just don't know what their connection was.
So William Scarlett Hagans is born into this fairly prominent family in the Fremont, Nahunta area. Do we have any indication of what their politics were like? Because we know that one of the things that's very important to Charles B. Aycock, and one of the things that's important to his father, is their identification with the Democratic Party at the time. You know, the party of the Confederacy, the party of secession, the party that's largely allied with, you know, the huge slaveholders in the region. How do the Haganses fit into the political scene during this time period?
The Haganses were staunch Republicans. Obviously, the party of Lincoln, the party of emancipation, though emancipation was not an event for Napoleon Hagans, it certainly was for his wife, for William's mother. They were staunch Republicans. Napoleon was active in the Republican Party as early as the 1870s. He did not hold elected office, though there were a number of men, particularly men who had been free men of color, who were elected to countywide office in the 1870s and 80s. He was not, but there are a number of mentions of him as being a sort of stalwart of the local Republican Party. And it's certainly the positions to which his sons ascended suggests that not only did Napoleon have the advantage of wealth to gain his children access to certain positions, but he also had standing in the Republican Party. Both Henry and William served as secretaries to Congressman George H. White. And Henry also served as an assistant to John C. Dancy of Tarboro, who had been appointed U.S. Recorder of Deeds in the early 1890s.
So I assume that, you know, with some of these secretarial positions and some of their connections in politics, there must have been there must have been a pretty considerable education that, that these Hagans has received. I mean, obviously education is very important to Charles B. Aycock. I understand that Hagans went to school in Goldsboro, and then he goes to university. Could you tell us a little bit about the schools that the Hagans family were affiliated with?
Yes, Henry and William went to the graded schools, so that would have been, grades 1 through 8, roughly, in Goldsboro. I don't really know exactly which school. I know there were both public and private schools in Goldsboro at the time. If there were a private academy, I imagine that's where they went. But certainly they attended those. William also, at least for a time, attended school in Fayetteville at the precursor of Fayetteville State, or maybe perhaps it's a lot of these universities had, or colleges at the time had sort of preparatory divisions.
Mm-hmm.
And E. Smith, who was a free man of color, born in Duplin County, but came to adulthood in Wayne County, was a close associate of the Hagans family, and he was the head of this school in Fayetteville. And so William attended there at least for a period, but both brothers went to high school at Howard in Washington, D.C. Howard had a preparatory division, and they both attended Howard. Henry came back to North Carolina and received his undergraduate degree at Shaw University in Raleigh.
Oh, wow.
But William remained in DC and got an undergraduate degree at Howard, and then attended what was then called Howard's Law Department. So he didn't get a JD, but he got some sort of legal training after he got his bachelor's degree. Yeah.
Which is similar to Charles B. Aycock. He goes to UNC in the 1870s, and UNC at this time is not a school that's open to non-whites. But at the same time that men like Charles B. Aycock, George Henry White is going to Howard University while Aycock is going to UNC. They both end up practicing law. Obviously, their careers take them in similar but different directions. What kinds of people is William Hagans like interacting with while he's in Washington, D.C.? Is this where he's meeting a lot of his like future connections?
Well, it's interesting. He seemed to have led this really, it's almost an alter ego life. There was a newspaper called the Washington Bee. It was an African-American newspaper that closely followed both sort of political news, but also social news. And there are all of these references to William Hagans, going back to North Carolina for the Christmas holidays, or William Hagans is back in DC after having invited his friends to North Carolina to go hunting.
Oh, wow.
There was this party or that party,
mm-hmm.
and William Hagans was there, secretary to George White. So he had quite the active social life in Washington. And even after he married, his wife was from Goldsboro. Her name was Lizzie Burnett. She was also a descendant of a free family of color, one of the oldest ones in Goldsboro. So they married, and they lived for a time in DC. This would have been, I guess, at the end of his service as secretary to George White. And there's a reference to the Haganses, having arrived in Washington and renting an apartment, I guess for the season or
Yeah,
whatever,
on
I
Oak
guess while
Street.
Congress is in session.
Yeah.
So they, but their home was in Goldsboro. They built, Napoleon Hagans died in 1896, and his wife had died the year before. So his property, which at that point totaled just under 500 acres, was split between his sons. And Henry was a teacher. He was principal at the state colored normal school in Goldsboro, and then was a professor for a short while at the precursor to, well, not the precursor, but North Carolina State A&T was once known as A&M, and he was a professor at A&M for a while. But he sold a good bit of his property to his brother William, and William was sort of the gentleman farmer. He kept his father's house, which is still standing, out northeast of Fremont, and oversaw his tenant farmers. He had bunches of, he didn't actively farm, he rented all of his property to tenant farmers. And that was the source of his wealth. It enabled him to live, I would not say a life of leisure by any means, but it certainly meant that he received income that from the labor of other people. He taught as well, taught at his brother's school. In North Carolina, it's interesting. It's hard to get a sense of the social, who his social circle would have been. Certainly, he was connected to the men in the Black Second who were, politically active, and there's evidence of ties. There, for example, I do a lot of research in Wilson County, which is adjacent to Wayne, but particularly with, from where their father lived, from where they grew up, I don't know, maybe a quarter mile from the Wilson County line. So very, very close connected. There is evidence of real estate transactions between prominent men, African-American men in Wilson who were Republican Party activists, so to speak, and the Haganses. They sold land back and forth. They served as guarantors for loans for one another. So that would have been his, circle in Goldsboro. And of course, the other Goldsboro families that had, by the turn of the 20th century, achieved some sort of status as this very small Black middle class.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So he's very well educated. He's got a law background. He's dabbling, well, he's doing more than dabbling in politics. I mean, he's in DC working for the only representative of color in DC at the time, representing this congressional district. Well, at the time, this congressional district, the Black Second. But then things at home are rapidly changing, right? So in 1896,
Mm-hmm.
there's a Republican governor of North Carolina, who, while not necessarily progressive, is doing a lot to help out the Black community, or at least a lot more than what other politicians would have done. But then we have a series of events, like in 1898 with Wilmington and the very violent political season in 1899, and then in 1900, this violence doesn't really go away. The same election cycle that brings Charles B. Aycock to power also ratifies a suffrage amendment, Section 6, Article 4, or sorry, Article 4, Article 6, Section 4 of the state constitution, which puts a literacy clause, in the voter registration procedure, with the grandfather clause and everything. So you need to be able to read or write any section of the Constitution in English to the satisfaction of the test giver. You also need to pay a poll tax in order to register to vote. Charles B. Aycock signs this into law in the first couple weeks of his time as governor of the state, and almost immediately many thousands of African-American men and other people of color in North Carolina, other men of color, lose their right to vote or their ability to vote in this state. George Henry White leaves office in March 1901, and is the last person of color to serve in Congress at all until the 1970s, the last one from North Carolina to serve until the 1990s. What happens to William Hagans during all of this? Because he goes from this life of political involvement and this kind of upward trajectory, and then everything changes. Suddenly the vast majority of African Americans in North Carolina can't vote now. They can't go out and register to vote, and they can't participate in the democratic process. What does he do? How does he handle this changing political climate?
It's interesting. So we talked a little bit about the number of free people of color in Wayne County prior to, the Civil War. Well, when it came time to register to vote or to pay poll taxes after the suffrage amendment, many of the descendants of those people, children, grandchildren, went right back to register. And they noted, they claimed the grandfather exemption. My grandfather, free people of color were allowed to vote in North Carolina prior to 1835.
Right.
And so if a person could demonstrate their descent from a person who had voted, then they were, there you go, they were eligible. And so what was interesting was that both William and Henry registered under the grandfather clause. Henry cited his qualifying ancestor as his father, which wasn't quite accurate because, of course, his father was not born until 1840. But I don't know, presumably his grandfather, who we don't know, was alive and eligible to vote prior to 1835. William, on the other hand, cited his maternal grandfather as his qualifying ancestor. He named Dr. Ward as his qualifying ancestor. Now, I don't know what the registrar made of that. I don't know if the registrar understood that the Dr. Ward that William was referring to was a white slave owning, wealthy man from the next county over, who actually had died not too long prior to 1902. But that's who William named. So it was really interesting to me that that's sort of they took these different paths. We don't know a lot about William's life during that period. Certainly, he retreated from public life, but he remained active, buying and selling real estate. There's a really interesting transcript. It's in the estate file of Thomas Artis of Nahunta, and it involves a dispute over 30 acres of land that William had inherited from his father, had sold to a white man named J.F. Coley. And Thomas Artis filed suit against Coley, saying that this was his property, that Napoleon Hagans had sold this land to him, and that he was essentially paying a mortgage to Napoleon Hagans at the time of Hagans' death, so that William had no right to sell this land to Coley. Obviously, typically in that sort of situation, the seller is the guarantor of the property, and he should have sued Hagans, but he didn't. He sued Coley. And it's dozens of pages. There are 12 witnesses, black and white, who testify not only to sort of the actual, the legal issue, but who testify to these relationships in this community. And there's this really interesting, testimony about how, Hagans came from town, out to his place in Nahunta, and he was on his buggy, and he saw Mr. Coley, and Mr. Coley wanted to buy the land, but he couldn't afford it. And he said, give me a couple of days and maybe I can, raise the money. And there are all of these interesting ways of sort of like reading deference in the testimony. The Coley and another person who's involved, Wright, what was his name? Wright Cox, I think. They are Mr. They're the only Misters in the testimony. William Hagans is called Hagans. And then Thomas Artis, who was the lowest status of all, was just called Tom. He was a tenant farmer. He's Tom. Yeah. But Hagans is there. And then there's Mr. Coley, even though obviously William Hagans is the wealthiest person involved in this entire, scenario, but he doesn't rate Mr.
Despite
Coley
the fact that he's worked for a U.S. representative. He's lives near, exactly. He lives like 2 blocks away from DuPont Circle in Northwest DC. He's been around and he's done stuff and he knows people, yet he still doesn't rate Mr.
He doesn't rate Mr. So, he's wheeling and dealing and kind of, buying up property, but then he also starts right around 1910, he starts to sell it. And he and his wife migrated to Philadelphia around 1913. They had several children, all girls and a boy. I can't think off the top of my head, 5 girls maybe and a boy. And they left, and he set up in Philly as a realtor. His wife died not long after. So William and Lizzie Hagans pulled up stakes, took their children, moved to Philadelphia. There's a really interesting letter that William writes to the publisher of the local newspaper. I think it was called the Daily Argus at that time. And he says, just wanted to let my dear friends in Wayne County know how I'm doing. I love Wayne County, and the only reason that we left was so that I could secure a top-notch education for my children. But other than that, we would have remained. So that's his stated reason for leaving.
And
But as
and
far
that's not the first time that a Hagans is on the record in an official capacity saying that things aren't that bad in Wayne County, but maybe not exactly the case, because Napoleon is in a congressional deposition in the 1870s.
yes,
In
1880.
Oh,
In
in
1880. Yeah, he was part of the Exoduster hearings, Senate commission that was called to explore the reasons that freedmen were migrating from the South to the Midwest, especially Kansas and Indiana, by the thousands. I mean, this is the first, voluntary migration of African Americans in the state. I mean, in the country. And Napoleon travels to Washington and testifies. He talks about his beginnings. He talks about his property, and he talks about his tenants and those of other African American men. And he's asked some really direct questions about conditions especially political conditions for African Americans in Wayne County. And he is generally, positive. He does not say anything that, would make white people nervous. But he does, at least as I read it, if you really parse his words, there are some, I think there are two kind of takeaways. One, there is a sort of subversive undercurrent to some of his assertions. I mean, for example, he talks about, in terms of equal treatment in the court system. And he makes the pointed remark that his advice to Black people is, don't do anything to get arrested, because basically, that you're not going to have the same shake. And what also comes across is a real sort of quiet, I think, pride in, and understandable pride in what he had been able to accomplish. So, Napoleon stayed where he was, but as did Henry Hagans. But William sort of presaged the Great Migration, and moved his family a little bit ahead of when it really kicked in earnest around World War I. He was already in place in Philly, and didn't look back. I don't think any of his children ever visited North Carolina. They knew where he was from. They had actually a rather grand notion of how he had grown up and sort of where he had grown up. I think, I'm guessing he encouraged that view, sort of his childhood, which was comfortable, but the house that he grew up in was small, by today's standards. It was not a white columned mansion, but certainly it was the type of house that a prosperous farmer would have built for his family. And to the extent that there were very few men who achieved what his father had, he and his brother grew up in exceptional circumstances. So yeah, he winds up in Philly and does not do well in the Great Depression, like many people who sort of dealt in real estate, and spent his final years in relative, I don't know if poverty is the right word, but certainly in reduced circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
And died in Philly in the 1940s.
Yeah, and he's buried in Pennsylvania, I take it.
He's buried in Pennsylvania. Mm-hmm.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I mean, I think a lot goes to show how much the white supremacist revolution of which Charles B. Aycock was a part, how much that impacted members, especially of the Black community. He goes from brushing shoulders and, spending time between Washington, D.C. and Goldsboro and teaching in these colleges and things. And then suddenly everything just comes to a screeching halt. And America is plunged, into Jim Crow. And millions of Americans.
Yeah, it must have seemed. Yeah, it must have seemed. Yeah, it must have seemed like a really bleak future for his children, who were, I think the oldest child was born in 1899. So, they were infants when this, toddlers, when everything sort of went topsy-turvy. And he and his wife gave it another 10 years and pulled up stakes. So they had lived on Oak Street just behind, so the synagogue faces James Street. Yeah, the synagogue was at the corner of James and Oak. And their house would have been behind the synagogue, facing Oak Street, there in Goldsboro. And it's no longer there. It's torn down at some point quite some time ago. Henry's house is gone too. Henry is buried actually in Elmwood Cemetery. But Henry had only one son, and after his death, his wife moved back to Virginia. Well, she was from Danville, Virginia, and his son also lived in Virginia. So there are no Haganses, no direct descendants of Napoleon who are still in Wayne County. But there are many descendants of William's children. Sort of, some are in Philadelphia, some are, they're sort of scattered all over now, but his children, his daughters in particular, had many children, and it's a pretty good sized family. Yeah.
Wow. If there was one big takeaway, or if you have a particular aspect or a particular fact about William Scarlett Hagans, what do you think it would be?
I think what's really interesting to me, I don't know if this quite answers your question, but what's really interesting to me about William and his cohort is that they lived in this period, this sort of brief flowering of potential. North Carolina's history is so different from other southern states, and and that these other southern states, the end of Reconstruction, that just shut it down.
Yeah.
And North Carolina was different, and so throughout the 1870s and 80s, people were still being elected to, again, to minor elective office. People are voting in good numbers. For a man like William, who was born into a property owning family, this must have seemed like such, a great time to be alive, right? Like there's this, he's educated in DC, he's got this urban sort of social life for part of the year. And then the other part, he's at home, he's hunting, he's, doing these things. And then, as you said, it just, that window closed. And it's interesting to me to think about what his life would have been like had that opportunity remained open, and had these men and their families been able, well, they could have stayed in North Carolina, but had the circumstances been such that they felt that North Carolina was a place in which they could flourish, just sort of things might have been, had they been able to stay.
And I think it's also interesting to observe the fact that, between the end of the Civil War and the time that Charles B. Aycock spent as governor, and he was governor from 1901 to 1905, there were always wolves. There were always people that were presenting an existential threat, a political threat, an economic threat to the Black community in North Carolina. But a family like the Hagans family, individuals like Napoleon Hagans, when he's grilled in Congress, he's being grilled. One of the senators that's grilling him is Zebulon Vance,
Zebulon Vance,
the secession governor, the redeemer of white supremacy in North Carolina. And here he is, and he has to ask this guy, Napoleon Hagans, for the answers. You've got the turbulent summer of 1898, 1899, 1900, and they have to deal with the fact that there's the only Black representative in Congress that represents their district in Washington, D.C. And it's not until 1901, especially with that suffrage amendment, that door not only swings closed, but is really locked behind them. And it seems like there's not a whole lot that they can do to challenge it. I feel like there was at least, there was a decent chance at a fight, and then the game was completely and utterly rigged against them. And it must have been very difficult.
Yeah, I mean, there's a parallel kind of now. I mean, there's a real, in these communities, there's a real brain drain, if you will, from these communities. I mean, it's hard now to if you kind of wander around rural Wayne County or Wilson County or anywhere in the Black Second, really, it's really hard to imagine people inhabiting this landscape because they said brain drain. They left. They wanted the best for their children. They educated their children. The Haganses were a little unusual because they went to Howard, which I'm guessing was the influence of George White, whereas most similar families sent their children to Shaw or to St. Augustine or to some over to Charlotte to what was then called Biddle, Johnson C. Smith, or Livingstone. But these children very seldom returned, and that's not a surprise. I mean, there were some who did. Obviously, another contemporary of the Hagans brothers was Samuel Vick, in Wilson who attended Lincoln University, which there was kind of a Wilson to Lincoln pipeline. And he came back, and he was also very active in the Republican Party, and there was a huge battle, with him, and an appointment to postmaster position that he got. He basically took, if you will, the appointment from Josephus Daniels' mother, and became postmaster. And that was, it seems like such a simple thing now, but it was incredibly fraught. There's just, you read the newspapers of the day, and there's just all this back and forth, like Vic still, appointed postmaster, or, there's testimony about why he shouldn't be postmaster, and he's not qualified, and the mail has gone to hell since he's been the, postmaster. But very similar sort of dynamics to William. And in fact, William Hagans was nominated for a postmaster position in Goldsboro, which he didn't get.
Yeah.
But it was, I think an amazing time, especially for men, to who were sort of fulfilling their parents' dreams, the first generation born after slavery, and who were able to be educated, and who I think were positioning themselves to kind of lead their communities into the 20th century. And suddenly the rug is ripped out from under them. And as I said, many of them left. George White went to New Jersey. He and Sam Vick actually, he and Sam Vick founded a Whiteville, New Jersey, which was a sort of a planned community, African-American community. Sam Vick, sort of handled the actual, sales part of it with his real estate background, but it didn't do too much. But it's a fascinating era, and really, really amazing people.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for sharing what you know about
thank you.
About your relative, and such a notable such a notable local historical figure whose name deserves to be remembered, and his story deserves to be retold.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much, Tyra.
Oh, thank you.